Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. These are your two sharp needles, Jack Stanley and Gavin Rice. And today we are going to be talking about instrumental solos and recording.
And of course, the banjo
Yes,
is such a big part of all that because you got to think back in the early days, it was always part of a minstrel show, always part of a local show. Banjo players were everywhere. It was such a popular thing in the 19th century, and it recorded so damn well.
exactly. Now, people always wonder about the shape of the banjo. Now, what I have here is a 1912, maybe a little bit earlier, about 1910, Bacon. That's the name of the maker. His name was Frederick J. Bacon. And not only was he a banjo maker, he was a banjo player. This was his choice of banjo when playing up until the 20s. This banjo, there are only two known examples of this custom FF Professional in existence. The other one, I'm not exactly sure where it is, but this is seen in a photo with its original owner. And you may notice that my strings are not made of steel. Yes, this one right here may look like it's made of steel, but that is not steel. These are made out of nylon because originally banjo, this is a regular banjo or the modern nickname 5-string banjo. They were originally strung with gut strings, which people did not, a lot of people don't understand that. And all your favorite recordings of Wes Osman, Fred Bacon, and Fred Van Epps, all of them are strung up with gut strings. Steel strings were not exactly around at this point, and it would have been very difficult to play with your fingers with steel strings because if you notice, I'm playing entirely with my fingers. And I do that interesting tremolo effect by wiggling my finger. And that is actually how banjo players did that back in the day. And the front of the banjo looks like a drum. This is known as the head or the pot of the banjo, as we say in banjo repair tech. So the pot is of a circular shape, of course, but the head is actually made out of calf skin. So a young cow would have been killed and its hide would have been stripped right off, taken away all the fat, this, that, dehumidified, dried out, and turned into a banjo head or a drum head. And it's really interesting because going back into the 1840s, in Baltimore, where the first banjos were made, all of the banjo makers were actually previously drum makers, which is really interesting. And just for a little bit of background information, banjo is the Gambian word for papyrus, because in Gambia, they have a similar instrument known as the banjo. And it has a skin head and made out of gourd. It's a gourd with skin tacked over it and gut strings just like this, except there are no frets. The banjo actually comes from the Gambian and sub-Saharan African instrument known as the akonting, which I really encourage everybody to look into. And you'll really see where the influence comes because originally in the 1840s after the Civil War, I know I'm talking quite a lot about this, but this is very important to understand. Banjo was played in a stroke style or claw hammer style. Kind of like that. And then in the 1880s, 90s, 19 teens, and 20s, then came the classic style playing that we call now. Nobody really kind of knows the name. It was called classic then because of classical guitar. You play it very similarly, or it was called finger style back then, but you mainly use your fingers and you would use that to play popular tunes, such as I did before to open up the show. So banjo had an absolutely ginormous role in recording because you may notice it is quite loud and percussive. I'm going to demonstrate that.
Okay.
As you can hear, I'm just goofing around as a little demonstration, but it's very percussive and it can be very direct. This was why Exactly. This is why guitar was not favored as far as either banjo or guitar. And also, banjo was a very popular instrument at the time. It was a new thing. You know, every time a new instrument came out back in the Victorian and Edwardian era, people were like, oh, "Let's reinvent it. Let's do this. Let's do that." Um, and then in the jazz age, people kind of started to shy away from the regular banjo, or as I said, the five string. Then they moved to the plectrum banjo, which is exactly the same scale length as a five string banjo, just minus the fifth string, and you would play it with a pick. And also the tenor banjo came along, which is tuned a little differently. And that's what you hear in a lot of Paul Whiteman recordings. Gene Goldkett and his orchestra from 1927 and a little bit onward when Howard Quixell played in the band. He played on a Wayman Style 4 plectrum banjo, a really great banjo, wonderful sounding. I'm a proud Wayman owner. I own a Style 6 tenor banjo that was supposedly used by Fred Buck in Waring's Pennsylvanians, which is really cool. And so that is the role of the banjo in recording. We're going to talk about other instruments too. And Jack, I encourage you to talk a little bit about what you know.
Well, the one thing I wanted to mention is, yeah, the banjo was such an easy game. You know, like we just talked about this for about a minute before we went on to record that we're going to talk about instruments. And so I tried to grab something, and I found here a Columbia cylinder. And this is El Capitan March, played by banjo, of all things. That's pretty amazing if you think about it. But they had the banjos doing just about everything. And there's other instruments, of course, that were stringed that were very unique to recording, and perhaps none is more unique than the Stroh violin.
Thank you. I was going to mention that. You are exactly right. And the Stroh violin, if you're not familiar with what it is, what the idea was back then in the acoustical era is that violins as solo instruments recorded great. However, in the orchestral setting, violins kind of got overdone by the brass, which is, of course, normal. So, what makers, and it's really funny because Stroh violins are a combination of phonographs and violins. Um, the if you're not familiar with the anatomy of a violin, you have the strings, which are held up by a bridge in the center, which vibrates the top of the violin, and then a post in the middle called the sound post in the center of the violin transfers those vibrations down to the back of the violin and helps bring the sound out. Stroh violins, or also known as Strovalus violins, um, they utilize a metal diaphragm, sometimes mica, sometimes metal, um, to transfer the vibrations from the strings down to a diaphragm and out through a horn. So now you can direct the sound directly towards the horn, and you have a horn facing a horn, whereas a violin player would literally have to tilt up and down in order to point the F holes directly towards the horn. Now a violin could be stationary and point. Some early Strovalus violins or other ones have a movable horn, which is really interesting, and they're really wonderful instruments. Any gurus of Boardwalk Empire, my very good friend Vince Giordano in the first episode is seen playing a Strovalus violin. I'm pretty sure his is an original Stroh violin. A lot of makers in Europe copied the original Stroh design, and they were called different things, but they're really wonderful instruments. Of course, they don't sound great in person compared to a real violin, but when recording acoustically, you can barely tell the difference because when recording a regular wooden violin, on acoustic records, you're losing some sound frequencies, of course, that you would hear normally in person. But the Stroh violin is built to kind of eliminate those frequencies already, so you can just have clear projective tone into the recording horn.
We did a series. I did a series of wax recordings of Stroh violins in the 1990s, and it was really great. I mean, we learned a lot on how, because basically when you record doing old technology, you have to relearn what the old technology was. And we eventually had a piano set up with a board to reflect the sound and a Stroh violin played right into the horn. Now, the thing that's very difficult, we had a professional violinist, and he complained over the fact that it was very hard to keep the pitch with the Stroh violin. It was a little difficult to do, and he had to really work very, very hard. And I was going through Edison's notes, and he just wrote Stroh violin, no good. That was the end of that.
True.
Of course, Victor used the Stroh violin quite frequently, and you can really hear the sound of it on many of the recordings, because it is a unique sound. It isn't pretty. It's sort of like Ethel Merman. Ethel Merman could sing great on Broadway. She didn't sing pretty, but God, she was loud, and she filled the theater. And so same thing with the Stroh violin and the Stroh viola and the Stroh bass, which is really interesting.
Yes, and they actually made all of the families. They even made a Stroh banjo, believe it or not, which is really strange.
I would imagine they make a Stroh guitar too.
They probably did at some point. I don't know of any in existence, but of course it was a novelty. And most of the Victor recordings from, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, from about 1908 to about 1915, they're using Strohvelus violins. And that I'm fairly certain that's about when, and then they switched back to regular violins at around 1915, 16. I'm not exactly sure, because it was I believe Stroh violins were made in England.
Well, yes, Stroh was from England. Yes.
Right. So it was very difficult during the war to get those imports through, so, but yes, they did make the entire string family into Stroh violins. And I've actually played every single member of the Strohvelus stringed instrument family. I've played a Stroh violin, a Stroh viola. I've played a Stroh cello, which I will say quite crudely, people refer to nowadays as a Jap fiddle. I'm not sure why, but I guess it could sound like a Asian instrument. But like I said, these were a novelty item that they thought would catch on. But of course, nobody really recorded solo Stroh violin back then.
There are reasons for this.
Yes, exactly. Now, another really interesting.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Jack. I'm sorry. I hate to interrupt.
No. Just a quick thing to mention to you that, of course, the recording technology has everything to do with the survival of the Stroh violin,
right?
Because it was a strident sound, and that's a very important thing to understand. That with acoustic recording, it was somewhat of a flat recording method, and it really loved the strident sound, the banjo, snare drums from a very good distance, Stroh instruments. And amazingly, I have a bunch of tests here. The harp was an amazingly good instrument to record. And just something, you didn't have a lot of harp solos, but nonetheless, they thought the harp wouldn't record, but they found out, instead of putting it in front of the recording orchestra, it was put toward the back because of its quality.
And not everybody knows this, but the first recorded instrument, Jack, I'm sure you know what it is. The first recorded instrument was the cornet.
Yes.
Which is very interesting to talk about, because the difference between a cornet and a trumpet, number one, right off the bat, the trumpet did not really, as we know today, the modern trumpet we know today did not exist in the 1870s when Thomas Edison was, experimenting, and his lab rats were, experimenting with these things. So the point of the cornet really, and the differences between the trumpet and cornet, is that the cornet has what's known as a conical bore. The bore of a brass instrument is the exponential trumpet, per se, the exponential growth, starting from the end of the mouthpiece to the end of the bell. The bell is the last part of the trumpet where you see flared out. Most trumpets that are built nowadays are not conical bore. They start to flare out at just after the valve block, which is really interesting. Whereas cornets, right at the start of the mouthpiece, as I mentioned, they have a very steady exponential growth, which changes the tone, and it's a very warm and pleasant thing. And it blends really great with an orchestra, whereas a trumpet is more direct and psh, 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 which is why you hear that more in jazz orchestras in the later era.
Okay, that makes a
But
lot of sense.
Right. And people actually think that the cornet was the most popular instrument during the 1920s in the jazz age. It was, in fact, not. Everybody played on trumpets because it was hot jazz. You could play hot jazz on a cornet. There are a couple people who did, but the trumpet was the more favorable instrument because it was more direct and could cut through the trombones, the saxophones, the drums, this, that.
Let's nail a myth here for a second.
Sure.
When it comes to the trumpet and comes to the cornet, or I should say, what's the bugle? Is the bugle closer to the cornet or closer to the trumpet?
Good question. The bugle is actually closer to the cornet because it has a conical bore, but it doesn't have any valves.
Okay. Very
So
good.
the bugle has no valves, and you can change the pitch of the note by utilizing the partial series that's in every brass instrument. The partial series is 1 5 1 3 5 7 1 2 3 sharp 4 5 and onwards. So I know it's silly, but
could you repeat for the radio audience, please?
exactly. If you want to hear that again, rewind.
Here's some examples here.
Ooh,
That
Berliner.
individual who was doing those recordings was a fellow by the name of W. Paris Chambers. He was always into novelty. This is a Berliner recording by Chambers. And this is from 1897.
Excellent.
And incidentally, an interesting thing to share is bugle. This is from the Spanish-American War.
Oh, wow.
This is Theodore Roosevelt's trumpeter from the Rough Riders.
Wow. Oh, that is wonderful.
We'll have to play that on here one of these times.
Please do, and please link that on your page. That's remarkable. Wow, that is really cool. I would love to hear that. Now, the bugle is known as a wartime instrument, and the bugle goes back to the Civil War. Of course, the cornet does as well, but the bugle has no valves, and it's used for making calls, which actually goes back to BCE.
Okay.
Even in the Bible, I am not a very religious person. I haven't really read the Bible, but I know that David had trumpets. There were trumpets playing. Trumpets are mentioned. I learned this in a very wonderful lecture, that trumpets were known for being used in the time of David and Goliath at that time. So that was thousands upon thousands of years ago. And the bugle is basically keeping that tradition of trumpets. Back then, trumpets they weren't curled. Oh, well, yes, they were, but going back to before Christ in the David era, they were long tubes made out of copper, not brass, copper, and they were terrible to play.
Before cornet.
BCE, before cornets existed. And so the biblical trumpet is a long, and there were actually trumpets found in King Tut's tomb, by the way.
Yes.
They were made out of copper tubes, and they were terrible to play. And the partial series were all over the place, and they were used for making calls. And in the Celtic tradition, they had a big tube that would go all above their head, and it was for wartime. So bugles are basically the Western version of these instruments. Of the Egyptian trumpet, of the Israeli trumpet, whatever. They're used for wartime and making calls and stuff like that.
Now, here's something very interesting with recorded sound. It was a mistake to do so But one of those trumpets from Tutankhamun's tomb was actually played.
Yeah.
And when they played it, it shattered.
Yeah.
But there is a recording snippet of that trumpet playing.
That recording is from the 60s or 70s, right?
1930s.
Oh. I think I've heard it, but
1960s, they wouldn't have been this insane to try to play a 3,000-year-old instrument.
Right.
They would make a copy of it.
Right.
I mean, and unfortunately, when he hit a certain note, it just shattered.
Oh yeah, because that metal was so weak and brittle.
Of course, yes, it was ancient.
And it's actually interesting, similar to singing against the wine glass and making it shatter. Every object has a resonating frequency. It could be
Right.
this trumpet mute, this Coke glass, this computer. They have a resonating frequency, and in a wine glass, for instance, if you sing that exact frequency, it will vibrate and flex so much where the glass cannot. You're basically pulling it and pushing it until it shatters. And that is what happened to King Tut's trumpet, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately. There were two of them. Fortunately, the other one was not Tut.
Exactly. They learned their lesson. They learned their lesson. So
Now, what's another instrument that was very, very popular? And that is the piccolo.
yes, Sousa marches.
The piccolo was played quite a bit. And what was the fella's name?
I know who you're talking about.
I just here.
I just had that moment. I was like, what's his name?
In my age, I can call it a senior moment. In your age, you just
It's concerning. Let me see.
Hold on.
I'll look it up too.
It's George Schweinfest.
Yes, exactly.
That's his name. I can't find the record. Hold on. You see, folks, we plan things in ahead here, as you can see. Let's see. Here we are. George Schweinfest. Now, he's an interesting composer and player. This is a very early recording from 1891. And I will be frank and tell you it's a copy.
Yes, I can see that.
But this is George Schweinfest, and here is the information. And he
The
couldn't
metal electronica.
make
I know that one.
cylinders fast enough because they recorded well, and they were exceedingly popular.
Yes.
Until the piccolo stage kind of died, and it just kind of died out.
Yes.
In fact, if you think about it, the age of the solo instrument on record kind of died out too.
Yes. Yep.
By
right.
like 1910, 1912, I think people were sick of it.
Yes, they were. They really, really were.
Let's hear another banjo solo. Yeehaw!
Oh my God.
Or, play the piccolo. And with the advance of sound recording, where orchestras could be done, or small groups, you didn't have to have a loud, piercing piece of music on a cylinder or a disc.
Right.
It was sort of like the phonograph was growing up.
True. True. That's right. And another famous piccolo player that I just remembered the name of thanks to this device is Frank Mazziata, Frank S. Mazziata, I believe that wonderful, wonderful piccolo player. He was an Edison musician, and honestly, no, honestly, piccolo records are, I'm going to be honest, they are a little difficult to listen to. If you've really heard one, they're very shrill.
Now, he was the piccolo player in Hager's orchestra.
Exactly.
And you can always tell Hager's band because for some reason they always put him right by the horn. And it always picks up the piccolo.
Ay.
And
I
there he
know.
is.
I know it's difficult. So,
Well, yeah.
um, do you have anything else, Jack?
Well, as for instruments that influenced us, I think the main instruments that you have mentioned, the banjo, of course, was so important, and the piccolo was pretty much equal to the banjo, I would say,
True.
in popularity. And then to a lesser degree, the other instruments. And of course, once we get into the jazz age, everything changes, and the piano becomes a much more important instrument.
Precisely. Exactly. Exactly. So, we're just approaching the 30-minute mark, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to play a transcription of mine. I'm going to play exactly what Fred Van Apps played in his recording on a film, actually, of The Love Nest, which was a popular tune written in, I believe, 1920.
Yes. And
So
that was the theme song for George Burns and Gracie Allen.
that's right.
And so on my part, I will say goodbye. And the last thing you will hear is Gavin Ryan.
Here we go.